Thank you, everyone, for coming here today. So the last time I spoke here, I tackled U.S. immigration policy, and I thought that was a little, difficult. So I thought I would give myself an easier job and tackle the decline of America with my next talk. Um, oh yeah, very simple. Yeah, you all laugh, but Yolshim knows how I suffered tackling with this issue, this topic. Um, But yeah, this is a very serious question. The Pew Research Institute, they do public polling in America and across the world. The share of people who believe that America is in decline is rising. And also around the world, people will often assume that it's a given that America is in decline. In fact, I even have one friend who is from Russia originally, and her family said, "Oh, when America goes to crap, you can come here and get an apartment here in Moscow, right?" hmm Her name will remain anonymous because this is shared on the internet, and I want her to be able to visit her family in Russia. Um, but yeah, this is a pretty big thing. So can we go to the next slide? Uh, this is going to be yeah. Why don't you just click through and fill up the screen? Originally, I was going to do this, but I couldn't get it connected. Um, Possibly. You could try to set that up. So, when it comes to national importance in the world, there are two primary drivers of that in the international system. The two primary drivers of national power are wealth and population. So, the reason that America has been the mightiest nation in the world for many, many years, and probably the mightiest nation that's ever existed in recorded history, is primarily due to those two factors. We have an incredibly large population, and we have a great deal of wealth. Now, as I mentioned in my last talk about U.S. immigration, the population boom of America used to be a very, very small nation, like 1 million, couple million people at its beginning. Compare that to the largest country in the world in 1776, which was the Kingdom of France, had 28 million. It was 13 times larger. Now America has about 330 million people, and the nation of France now is hovering around like the 80 million, something like that. So it's totally leapfrogged these great European powers, driven by birth rate, yes, but also by our immigrant culture. We have, since our founding, we've always tried to encourage immigrants, with a few exceptions, to come to this country because we understood that that was important for our national growth, and also it was part of our founding principle, the freedom of human beings, the freedom of movement. So that's sort of what's driven American population growth. Now, in terms of wealth creation, there are two kind of big views on how somebody can get big and rich. Now, the first view is that wealth is created via the exploitation of the labor of others. So this is the Marxist view of history, which is that history is about class struggle. It's about the struggle between the exploiter and the exploited. A metaphor that he uses, Marx, is a baby chick, right, is born in an egg, right? And in order to live, the baby chick has to fight its way through the egg. So from its very first moment of being alive, it's fighting. And so life is struggle. But if you think about it, well, I'll get back to that. So that's the first view. If you want to get rich, you need to exploit others and steal their wealth. Have them work for you and capture the excess production that they're creating, capture it for yourself instead of letting them keep it. The other view of the creation of wealth was laid out by Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations. That was the first economic text that created a complete view of how free market economics works. And so Adam Smith's view was that it was through the voluntary cooperation, the division of labor, human creativity. This is how wealth was created. This was actually a pretty radical view at the time. The European countries, when he wrote this book, were engaged in style of economy called mercantilism. And so the idea of mercantilism was the economy was under the dominion of the state. And so it was sort of like they ran the economy like you'd run a house, the economy of your house. You want to take in more money than you give out. You want to control things. You want to manage things. You want to plan and budget. And so you had really, really large state-run companies. Like the best known one was the British Empire had the East India Company and the West India Company. And so almost all international trade within the British Empire was done by these state-run organizations. And so what these countries tried to do was they tried to sell more, export more than they imported, and try to get as much gold and silver hoarded in their coffers as possible. And they thought, if we have the most gold and silver, that means we're the wealthiest nation. Adam Smith pointed out, if you have a bunch of gold and silver sitting in a chest somewhere, that's not doing anybody any good. There's no wealth there. That's just, it's things are only beneficial to human beings when they're used. So actually the wealth of nations is in our ability to produce, right? Whether that's through our skills, the more skilled we are, the more productive our labor becomes, or through the creation of machinery, the improvement of land, the breeding of livestock, creating things that will actually create more production in the future. So this is the view of Adam Smith. And this is a style which is summed up with the words interdependence, mutual prosperity, and cooperation. So these two ideas is, if you want to get wealthy, the first one is, if you want to get wealthy, you need to exploit. The second idea is, if you want to get wealthy, you need to cooperate. It is my view that the second view is far more correct than the first. I think that exploitation is a dim shadow of cooperation. Now, when you look back at the history of the world, basically every society since in recorded history has engaged in exploitation through conquest, through enslavement. I believe, if I had to hazard a guess, I believe that's because people lacked the knowledge, the ideas, the social technology that was needed for people of differing cultures to cooperate. And so with their limited understanding, the best that they could hope, if they wanted to expand, their best that they could do was try to conquer, try to enslave. And so when one nation conquered another, they were like, okay, how do we get them to work together with us? We better just take them as slaves and use them that way. And so that was a very dominant idea for a long, long time. So I'm not saying that human history is not full of exploitation. Marx is right about that. I just think that that's not the only way to create wealth, and it's actually not the best way by far. You can take a look at the economy of the South in the United States. After it got rid of slavery, it did far better. And that is because you freed human beings to engage in the division of labor, to have creativity, to have voluntary exchange, rather than just being labor directed as at the will of the masters. So these are the two views. And when we talk about the rise of America and the rise of its wealth, we need to keep these in mind, because many of the people who believe that the U.S. is in decline believe that its rise was based on the exploitation of others, the exploitation of workers, the exploitation of slaves, the exploitation of other countries. Can we go to the next slide, please, and just fill it out? So we have to ask ourselves also, if we want to talk about the decline of America, what is the point of America? So here again, there are two ideas. So in the 1600s, there were two kind of colonies created here in America, one in the north in Massachusetts and one in the south in Virginia. And the one in the north, as we learn in school, was driven by pilgrims who were seeking freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. And in the south, people came here to create plantations to generate wealth. And so you can see from the inception of America, there are kind of two competing ideas of what America is. What's the point of America? To make a lot of money, or to create a model nation better than what we left in Europe. So If the point is to make a lot of money, then you might want to create an economic empire like they tried to do in the European nations. You would have a slave economy, you would exploit workers, you would exploit other nations. If you wanted to create a model nation, you would try to create not an empire, but a republic of laws, not of men. When the United States achieved its independence in 1776, it actually became the first constitutional republic in world history, founded on the consent of the governed and the rule of law. If you wanted to create a model nation, you would have one people, one family, transcendent of race, color, creed, religion, national origin. And you would try from many disparate peoples to create one unified nation. And so these are the ideals that were set up in our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution. Can we go to the next slide? Back one. Here I have a YouTube link. This is a speech from John Adams, the HBO miniseries. And this is him. Pause. So this takes place, this takes place when they are deciding, they're in the midst of a rebellion against the British Crown, and they're deciding whether or not to declare independence. At that point in the American Revolution, there were still two ideas. One was, we're just trying to get our fair rights as British citizens. And so we're fighting until we get that, and then we'll stop fighting, but we'll stay British citizens. And then the other idea was, we're going to start our own party here. Yeah, we're going to start our own nation. And so John Adams was on the side of, let's declare independence. In the middle of this war, let's declare independence. And the person who spoke before him was saying, if we do this, the British, who have only been going at us this hard, are going to double their efforts. They are not going to like the fact that we declare independence. They're going to bring down their full might on us. And this is John Adams' rebuttal. You can hit play.
Does it recognize as Mr. Adams, Massachusetts?
Yes.
Of the most stupendous measures which affect the lives of millions, born and unborn, now before us. We must expect a great expense of blood. Okay. We must always remember free constitution of civil government cannot be purchased at too dear a rate, as there is nothing on this side of Jerusalem of greater importance to mankind. My worthy colleague from Pennsylvania, spoken with great ingenuity and eloquence, has given you a grim prognostication of our national future, but where he foresees apocalypse, I see hope. I see a new nation ready to take its place in the world, not an empire, but a republic, and a republic of laws, not men. Gentlemen, we are in the very midst of revolution, the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of the world. How few of the human race have ever had an opportunity of choosing a system of government for themselves and their children. I am not without apprehensions. The end we have in sight is more than worth all the means. I believe, sirs, that the hour has come. My judgment approves this measure, and my whole heart is in it. All that I have, all that I am, and all that I hope in this life, I am now ready to stake upon it. While I live, let me have a country. A free country.
You can you can pause now. So that was pre-Declaration of Independence, and then subsequent to that, they voted and they approved the measure to sign the Declaration.
So that was signing the Declaration.
Precisely, yes. So that speech is not recorded in history, but those words are taken from, that they used in the miniseries are taken from various writings of John Adams, including what he wrote in the Massachusetts Constitution, which is the prototype of the U.S. Constitution. It was written with sections, articles, the Bill of Rights. It was, basically the U.S. Constitution is based on the Massachusetts Constitution, and the Massachusetts Constitution was written single-handedly by John Adams. The Massachusetts Convention, they selected a committee of like 20 people to talk about the Constitution, and they selected a committee of 3 people from that 20 to write it, and that committee of 3 people selected John Adams to write it. So he said, I was a subcommittee of 1. So he poured everything into that Constitution. And I would like to mention many of the things he poured into that Constitution were based on his conversations with his wife, Abigail Adams, who was like a luminary of that time, an incredible intellect. And they cooperated on everything throughout their whole lives. Their collection of letters is historic. The love expressed in them and the respect for intellectual equals is incredible.
So was the Massachusetts Constitution written prior to the Declaration of Independence?
No, it was written in 1780, I believe. And the reason I bring it up is because the Massachusetts Constitution abolished slavery, and it established the rights of all people, which, of course, it took time for those rights to be extended to women in terms of like property rights within marriage. The common law practice at the time was for men, the husband, to be in control of all joint property. But eventually, based on the words that were written in the Massachusetts Constitution, that was extended to women. And in fact, the word slavery was not mentioned. It was just the Bill of Rights of the Constitution said all human beings have the right to life and liberty. And there was a court case just a few years later where a slave was suing his owner for his freedom. And the court said, well, our Constitution says every human being. So they ruled in favor of the enslaved individual, and they made his owner pay him back money. And they also tried the owner for kidnapping. That was the crime that he had committed for enslaving this person. So I want to point out that John and Abigail Adams were very much in line of creating a model nation. This is a nation that was unlike anything that had ever existed in the world up to that point. Yes, there had been democracies before, which had fallen away, but they were trying to take everything that had been learned from history and put it into this nation to create something that could last through the separation of powers, through a constitution that couldn't be overruled by a simple majority. And there are many, many things I could mention. But the idea was to be a model, a prototype for what other nations could be, so that one day the whole world could be free. And so if that is the point of America, then seeing the rise of other nations economically, seeing the rise of other nations culturally, politically, that is not evidence of the decline of America. That's actually evidence of the success of America. if the point was to be a model and other nations get rich following that model, then we've done exactly what we're supposed to do. So Reverend Moon, the founder of Family Fed, said that the United States can be considered an elder son nation in the world, or an elder brother nation in the world. And if you think about it from that perspective, let's say that, when my oldest brother got his first job, his share of income among all of his siblings was 100%. None of us were making any money. He was making 100% of the money. He was the most economically powerful among all the siblings. And then when my brother got his job, it fell down to, 60%. And then when my sister got a job, and then when I got a job, now it's hovering around like 25%. Man, what has Godfrey been doing, to engage in such decline? So I just wanted to point that out. So I'd like to go on to some stats now. Let's go to the next slide. Here is the U.S. share of the world economy as measured in GDP. Okay, this starts in 1960, which is the very peak. 40% is the highest the U.S. ever got as a global share of GDP. Isn't that like freaking insane? Like 40%, just as one country, which started out with like a couple million people. And when it started, its GDP as a share of the world was 1 to 2%. It grew to be 40% after World War II. But after World War II, it didn't just shrink back into itself, return to, isolationism. It created the United Nations. It was in NATO. It created the Organization of American States, which is a union connecting all the states of North and South America. It tried to, spread the good times to the rest of the world. Now, it has made many blunders in that time. And the declinists like to point to those blunders and say, see, America is, terrible. They're failing, right? A couple examples I could point out. Vietnam, the war in Vietnam, the war in Afghanistan, the way that ended, the situation in Iraq, the situation in Israel. You could go on and on listing all of the failures. But my grandmother once said, on my mother's side, she's from France, she said, if you never do anything, you never break anything. So the fact that America has so many blunders to point to is just because they've been trying to do so much for the world. Now, I could talk at length about their mistakes, and I think it's really important if you want to be a patriot to acknowledge those mistakes. But the question we're trying to answer today is America in decline? Okay, if you look at the dark blue, which is the rest of the world, then you might say, yeah, we're in decline. Look, we used to be 40%. Now we're 24%. But if you look at the light blue, which is the U.S., it has done nothing but go up, except for a brief period in 2008, the recession, the financial crisis of 2008. How?
Now 26%.
The global share of GDP? Yeah. So it's now in 2023, it's 26%. Thank you for that. So it's done nothing but go up since the 1 to 2% in 1776. So that's like 250 years. Another thing I would like to point out is that people often like to say that America is a young nation. A young nation. And they say that because there are, European monarchies, Asian countries who trace their roots back thousands and thousands of years, whereas the majority of people who live in this country today, their ancestry has only been living here for like 300, 400 years or less. But when taken from the perspective of the government of America, our Constitution is actually the oldest continually active constitution of a sovereign nation in the whole world. So from the perspective of our government, we're actually the oldest government in the world. So that epithet we have, the elder son nation, is not just something plucked out of thin air. It means something. There's a reason why you could seriously consider America to be in the position of an elder brother to the rest of the world. Where we go wrong is when we try to usurp the position of like parent and think we can tell everybody what to do. What's that?
The oldest functioning constitution in the world actually is the Massachusetts.
Massachusetts.
Oh, that's true. Yes, but it's not a sovereign nation.
No, it's
Okay.
not.
Yes.
Can we just give let's Give it up for Massachusetts.
Massachusetts. That is absolutely true. Go to the Wikipedia page for the the Massachusetts Constitution. It's the longest active constitution in the world. Exactly. Yeah. So there were actually other states that created their constitutions first, and then they saw the Massachusetts Constitution. They're like, "Oh, we'll have that, please." So then they scrapped it and they created a new one from scratch. So, next slide, please. Okay, the United States is the most demographically vibrant of the current great powers, driven primarily by very successful immigration and immigrant integration. U.S. birth rate currently is 1.62 per woman, below the replacement rate of 2.1. It fell in the last decade below the replacement rate. If you take a look at, these are United Nations projections of what the most populous countries will be in 2100. You'll see that the U.S., while it falls to fourth, its percentage growth is greater than India, greater than China, greater than Russia, greater than Japan, greater than Germany, greater than all these other countries. Okay, so if you take a look here, India is 1380. By 21... India is 1380. By 2100, it'll rise to 1450, a very marginal increase, whereas the U.S. will go from 331 million to 434 million. So in terms of both absolute increase and in terms of especially percentage increase, it's growing much more quickly. There are other countries which are developing countries which are growing at a much faster rate, primarily in Africa. Nigeria. Yeah, especially Nigeria, which is the most populous country in Africa. So, again, the point here is, if you're thinking our point is to be an empire, like the biggest in the world, then the growth of a country like Nigeria will fill you with like, oh, we're supposed to be the biggest and the best. That's kind of the wrong attitude to have. Another point I would like to make, however, is that the United States has more habitable land than any other country in the world. The only other two countries that are bigger are Russia and Canada, but a great portion of those countries is too cold to support large populations, whereas the US, almost the entire country is habitable. And our population density is one of the lowest in the world. It's like 91 per square million, whereas other countries are way higher than that. I unfortunately can't remember the specific stat off the top of my head, but it's like some places are 10 times higher than that. And if you take a look at a nighttime image of America, or Canada for that matter, we have major population centers separated by vast swaths of darkness, just like no population. Now, if you go to the next slide. One more slide. Here is the rent price. So our economy is doing good. Our population is doing pretty good. What is not doing so good is the cost of housing in this country. Now, how do you square the fact that America has so much empty land, and yet it has one of the highest housing prices in the world? For instance, in New York City, to get a one-bedroom apartment in downtown New York City is $4,400, $4,500 a month to get a one-bedroom apartment. In London, which is just as much of an international city, just as cosmopolitan, it's about $2,000 a month to get a one-bedroom. In France, in Paris, it's $1,500 for a one-bedroom in downtown Paris. And in Japan, a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Tokyo is less than $1,000 a month. Smaller, yeah, a little bit smaller in terms of square footage, but that doesn't describe all of it. So Japan, which is an island nation, very rocky, very mountainous, very little habitable land, their housing prices are actually affordable. America, filled, abundant land, incredibly expensive. This is a huge problem. Yeah, so look at this is kind of baffling. Income. the percent change has been fairly low. Percent change of rent has been very, very high. And this is percent change per year, cumulative. The reason for that is not because of any, there's no natural reason for that. It's the structure of our land use regulations, the structure of our zoning regulations. It's both a federal, a state, and a local problem. And much of it is driven by the fact that people who currently own houses and land, they love to see those values just go up and up. And so there is a special interest invested in keeping these prices high. So that is a huge problem. And that's one of the reasons why America's birth rate is in decline, is because if you want to have more kids, you need more bedrooms. And those are incredibly expensive. So this is possibly the most foolish thing that our country does, is the way that we treat housing. And I don't have to tell you, we live in, Boston or near Boston. You guys feel this every day. This is a serious challenge that we're facing. One of the reasons why many feel that America is in decline is because, the GDP is growing, but for the average person, it's getting harder and harder to afford your rent. Can you go back one slide? Another reason why we might feel that our country is in decline, the civilian employment population ratio. So this is the percentage of the civilian population of the United States that is engaged in employment. It has significantly fallen since its heights of almost 65% around the year 2000, significantly fallen. And it has actually fallen again after the 2020 pandemic. And so people are struggling to find work. So while the unemployment rate may be low, the labor participation rate is definitely down, and people are feeling this. People have given up on working. People have given up on looking for a job, or maybe they still are looking, but the government statistics stop counting you as looking for a job after you've been unemployed for 2 years. If you've been unemployed for 2 years and you're still looking, then you don't count as unemployed anymore. That's one of the ways they keep the unemployment rate low. So I want to bring this up to say that there are valid statistical data-driven reasons to feel that this country is in a decline. Yolshim, next slide, please. Or rather, go ahead to the one after this as well. Okay, I wanted to point out some American strengths. As I mentioned, demographically vibrant, especially compared to the other great powers in the world. The two biggest ones right now are China and Russia in terms of their military and political influence within their sphere of influence. Those countries are both declining in population, whereas the United States is still growing. Our country is one of the best, according to some, the best at integrating new immigrants due to an immigrant culture and a culture of self-reliance, where in some European countries, immigrants come and they end up on welfare. In this country, federally, we have a rule that if you come to this country, you do not have access to federal welfare programs for your first 5 years of residence. So if you want to come here, you either have to have a family, you have to have support structure, or you have to work when you get here. And so as a result, you attract the type of people more so who are interested in working. And in this country, our culture is such that whatever your background is, if you're a hard worker, we tend to like you. We tend to respect you. Again, this is not to say that everybody is approving of new immigrants. There's a lot of rhetoric in the media right now that wants to decrease the amount of immigration, or that wants to pick and choose where immigrants can come from. And actually, every new wave of immigration that came was met with backlash. There was always an initial backlash, very much disliking the new wave of immigration, before eventually accepting them. But the point is, America eventually gets around to accepting them and feeling like, okay, you took your lumps, you're a part of us now. Other countries have a very hard time with that. And as a result, they are declining. Their birth rate is falling, and they have no immigration to back it up. Biggest example of this would be the of the great powers is the country of China, and the country with the lowest birth rate in the whole world is Korea, the South Korea. Okay, so another American strength. We are the biggest energy producer in the world. We didn't used to be. We used to be the biggest importer of energy in the world, but due to the discovery of natural gas, innovations in renewable energies, we still use nuclear power. We haven't shut it off. I think we could use a lot more nuclear power, safe nuclear power, but at least we aren't shutting it off like the country of Germany. So we're the biggest energy producer in the world. We lead the world in technological and scientific innovation, also medical innovation. The top tech companies in the world are dominated by American companies. Like if you look at the top 10, Apple, Facebook, Google, Tesla, Microsoft, so on and so forth. Many of those, I would like to mention, were founded by immigrants. Google was co-founded by an American and a Russian immigrant, Sergey Brin. Larry Page was the American, Sergey Brin was the Russian. Tesla was founded by an immigrant, Elon Musk, from South Africa. So, again, you can see. Go ahead.
Was the next generation. His father was
Right. Yeah. Steve Jobs was a second generation American. His father was an immigrant. Do you know which country from?
Lebanon or Syria.
From Lebanon or Syria. So, anyway, the point is, the great powers, if you go back through history, they often led the world in technological innovation. And that's one of the reasons why they kept their edge. America, by far, like 50% or more of Nobel laureates each year are Americans, and that's pretty much been the norm for many, many years. I'd also like to point out we lead the world in charitable giving as a percentage of income. We are number one and have been number one for a very, very long time. So this is not just a wealthy nation, it's also a very, very charitable nation. By some metrics, the U.S. alone, just in terms of the private population, their donations account for more than 50% of all private donations to charity in the whole world. Okay, so American citizens, not counting the government, their contribution to charity in terms of dollars is more than 50% of the whole world's contribution to charity from private citizens. Part of that is driven because we're very charitable people, but the other part of it is we're also very good at sales. So I don't know how often this happens to you, but people will knock on your door, give you a call, stop you on the street, like, please donate to our cause. They have the guts to come up and ask you to give money for free. And we do. So many people point to the fact that it's the moral fiber of a country that maintains it in the long run. And so here too, we can, have a positive point in America's favor. As I mentioned, the U.S. has more habitable land than any other country, and there is huge room for growth. I totally believe if we could solve the housing issue, like change the laws around that, we would see the birth rate go back up. And there's evidence to back this up, because women in this country, when they report how many kids they would like to have and how many kids they actually do have, the number that they would like to have is always higher, almost always higher than the amount that they are having, by about like 1 to 2 kids. Like it's a big gap between how many they would like to have and how many they do. And that's driven by affordability. Of course, the other aspect of having children is a cultural one, like a culture that, loves families and it loves children is one where people will have children. And even if you give people lots and lots of tax breaks and incentives, if there's not the cultural impetus to have kids, then that won't work. So that's another issue related to that. Right, religious people have more children, but that's because religious people usually it's a part of their faith that family and children is a good and noble thing to do.
Life comes from God, and you have no right.
Right, exactly. One, yeah. Just an anecdote about that. My brother was traveled to Arizona to visit our aunt and uncle, and he brought with him my parents, his wife, his 2 kids, and his wife was pregnant. And so he was the only able-bodied person. He had 2 little kids. His 2 elderly elder parents. Sorry, not elderly, elder parents, his pregnant wife. And so it was he said he did 4 times more physical labor during his 1-week vacation than he did in a normal week. So, and he noticed when he was traveling through the airports, there was 1/3 of people, when they saw the kids, they'd be like, oh my God, how old are they? What's their name? And they would like talk to the kid and play with the kid. Like they really loved seeing a kid. Then there was another 1/3 of people who just kind of like ignored, didn't pay attention. And then there was another 1/3 who would like give him dirty looks for holding up the line, or, like when the kid would make a noise, they'd be like, like an anti-child mentality. So that's difficult because it's new children who help support us when we get older. It's new children who are going to keep this country going. And so when you see a parent struggling with their kid in a grocery store or something like that, your heart shouldn't be like, oh, why are they inconveniencing me? You should feel, thank you. Thank you for your service. Just as you thank like a military veteran, thank you for your service. A parent, you should be like, thank you for your service. Paying for my Social Security. Yeah, exactly. Having a kid, it decreases your free time, your autonomy, your entertainment, your leisure. There's no reason that it makes sense from like a materialistic perspective. But because people have the will to do that, that's why our society works. So thank your local parents. Okay, another strength we have is that we have not overextended ourselves with traditional empire building. As much as people like to label the U.S. an empire because it gets itself involved with affairs all over the world, it is not like installed regional governors and put in military to try to maintain this empire. That is incredibly, incredibly expensive, and it's very easy to crumble. So when we make comparisons between the U.S. and the Roman Empire, you have to be aware the Roman Empire was a traditional empire. Many, many of the lands that they conquered, the people who lived there were not considered Roman citizens. And many of even the people who immigrated into Rome, they were not considered Roman citizens. They were like second-class citizens. And so this meant that when Rome started to crumble, people weren't that concerned about it. They were like, well, what do we owe the Romans anyway? And actually, it got so bad that their military ended up being composed primarily of foreign mercenaries in the Roman Empire in the late stages. I'm talking about the Western Roman Empire, not the Eastern. It was primarily composed by foreign mercenaries. And then when the Visigoths invaded and sacked Rome, many of the people who helped fight with them had actually been in the Roman military. They had literally fought for Rome, and then they turned around and invaded and sacked Rome. So America is in a totally different situation. You might more accurately refer to America as a hegemony, where you're kind of the first nation among many other nations. And America tries to exert influence on other nations, but it doesn't try to occupy them and control them. In fact, even when the U.S. got involved in the Middle East a lot in the 2000s and 2010s, every president was always talking about how quickly we're going to get out of there. We're going to set up a democracy. We're going to get them to vote for their own government, and then we're going to get out. Not being aware that to get a democracy to work, you need to build up a lot of other institutions first to support it, which is why in many cases it hasn't always worked out. Another thing, the thing that really ended the Roman Empire was the fact that it got invaded and sacked. The United States is basically impossible to invade. It has the Atlantic Ocean on one side, the Pacific Ocean on the other, and then 2 very, very friendly nations to the north and the south. So if you wanted to, it would just be impossible. Another reason is because the rate of gun ownership in this country is so high. Like you would have grandmothers taking pot shots, from apartment buildings. Like there's no way that we could suffer the same fate as the Roman Empire. And then the other thing is the Roman Empire engaged in hyperinflation. They printed so much money that there was almost no detectable amount of silver left in their minted coins by the end. Our central bank, as much as I like to criticize them for how much inflation they don't allow hyperinflation in the double digits, the triple digits that we see in other countries. So I consider that a strength. Does anybody else have another strength they'd like to point out? Any ideas? Yeah?
Well, I think that one of the fundamental reasons that our country, despite all these errors and criticisms that we admit to, will continue to thrive is because of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech.
Yes. Absolutely.
That is a source of blood flowing. It's the way that the original mind of all these brilliant immigrants and will contribute to the further improvement of the country. Countries that do not have freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, they stagnate.
Absolutely.
That's not going to happen here.
No flowing water.
No flowing water.
Yes.
So I think that that's crucial strength, that we really do believe. And anything that inhibits conscience and freedom of speech is an anathema to the future of this country.
Absolutely, yes. The freedom of speech and the freedom of conscience are what make this country work. Right now, there have been a lot of protests happening at campuses around the country. Pro-Palestine protests happening at like commencement ceremonies. Now, on the one hand, you might say, like, interrupting your university's commencement ceremony, how is that really helping the Palestinians? Or people might disagree about which side of that conflict to support. But I say, even if you think all these kids protesting are a bunch of idiots, idiots speaking freely is a feature of free speech, not a bug. You need to allow the idiots to speak freely, because then the smart people can speak freely too. And oftentimes, smart people seem like idiots at first, but it's only because they see what nobody else can see. And the thing about this country is, yes, there are sometimes riots that happen. For instance, in Colombia, the kids sat on the campus, in one of the campus buildings, the student union or Hamilton Hall, and they wouldn't leave. They were just completely disrupting things. And the university did everything they could to negotiate. But finally, they brought in the police. They arrested people for, trespass, and they cleared it out, and things went back to normal. So when you have a country that has a rule of law, then you can kind of keep things going. So you shouldn't just look at when things go crazy. You should also look, okay, how does it look 2 weeks later? How does it look a month later? Have things gone back to normal? So yeah, free speech is a really, really important reason. And it goes back to Adam Smith, creativity, division of labor, voluntary exchange. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here are some challenges facing America. Cost of housing, which I covered. Birth rate decline. The UN estimates that the US population will peak in the year 2080 and then begin to decline, even with immigration. We have political and cultural polarization and gridlock. Our politicians are incredibly heinous in their comments about each other. And then this is a really big one, the deterioration of norms and customs that uphold our democratic republic. So I don't want to engage in hyperbole here. Everybody always likes to think things have never been worse now than they've been before. But back in the 70s and 80s, we were worried about being nuked, right? Back in the beginning of the 1800s, the 1860 around there, we were in the middle of a civil war, right? Things were way worse back then than they are now. That doesn't mean things aren't bad now, but you have to keep things in perspective. But this is a problem, and if you don't address the problems as they come up, then they snowball and get worse. I would like to point out 2 examples of the deterioration of our norms and customs. One is Donald Trump trying to block the results of the 2020 election. Okay, people often compare him to like a dictator, like an African dictator who, after losing a democratic election, just takes the military, occupies the government building, and says, "I'm not leaving." What we had wasn't anywhere close to that. Our customs and our norms and our laws, the rule of law was reestablished. We approved the election, everything went forward. And when he tried to challenge it, subsequently, it was done through the courts, right? And so from one perspective, some people say, well, he did nothing wrong. It was mostly a peaceful protest. He told people to be peaceful. He challenged everything through the courts. So he didn't necessarily do anything illegal. But the point I like to make is that any culture, and especially a democratic culture, it's supported by laws on the one hand and customs on the other. So laws can never account for every single possible thing to happen. You also need customs, like things you just don't do to each other. And the more you erode those, the more the laws start to come into question, and things can snowball from there. So I do not think Donald Trump is an African dictator. I do not think that. But I think that the comparison is a little bit appropriate because he did try to challenge this, and then he said, oh, there's all this voter fraud, and then he couldn't prove it in a court of law. Why are you doing this? Why are you convincing half the country that we had an illegitimate election and then not getting the proof of it? Like, that's really bad. That's messing with a lot of people's heads. It's making us think that we don't even live in a democracy anymore. Like, if you're going to make that accusation, you better have ironclad proof. Otherwise, it's just incredibly dangerous to do. On the other hand, I would like to point out that the Democrat side is now engaged in trying to sue Donald Trump with every imaginable avenue that they can come up with to try to tie him up in court, take away his money, take away his right to be in the election. Now, again, are they doing anything illegal? Not really. Everything is done through the court of law. But is that a good tradition? Like, you have an opponent who's pretty darn popular, and the election is neck and neck. So now you're going to send all sorts of attorneys general, all sorts of prosecutors after him, trying to tie him up in court, take away his money, and beat him that way rather than beating him in a free and fair open election. Like, I want to point out that this has never happened before in my whole life, and I don't think it's ever happened before in the history of this country where one party is trying to win the election through the courts before the election even happens. Now, you could say it's a backlash because, Donald Trump he's the one who started it. He's the one who started eroding our customs and norms. We're just responding. But if you allow that type of thinking to continue, it can really snowball from there. So there are serious issues that we're facing in this election. I think we have definitely a choice of the lesser of two evils, or to go third party, in my opinion, in this election. And so that's a problem. So the point that I want to conclude with is that this country, founded on the idea of freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and that we're endowed by our Creator with certain rights, it has faced many, many crises in the past. It's faced a revolution against the greatest military in the whole world that lasted 8 years. It's faced civil war. It's faced the threat of nuclear annihilation. It's faced, decades of economic depression and stagnation in the 20s and again in the 70s. Every time it bounces back. And the reason that I believe that is because this country is founded on ideas that are inherent to human nature as endowed to us by God. And the idea is that when something is true to its nature, it will grow, it will flourish. And when it's not, it will decay and it'll wither. A good example of this, a plant. When you buy a plant at the plant store, there's a little card telling you what is the nature of that plant. Does it like sunny? Does it like shady? What type of soil does it like? What should the pH of the soil be? How good should the drainage be? And if you create the conditions that are true to that plant's nature, it will flourish and it will thrive. But if you plant it in bad soil or just soil that's not meant for it, it will decay and it'll wither. So using this analogy, I'm trying to make the point that the ideals of America, the model nation that we're trying to start, are based on ideals that are true to human nature and true to the nature that is given to us by God. Not perfect by any means, but because we have always managed to come back to that, and even subsequent generations have improved on that. After the Civil War, we enacted some of the greatest amendments to this Constitution ever. We abolished slavery. We created birthright citizenship. Anybody born here is a citizen. We're not like Rome, where we have Roman citizens and second-class citizens. We established equality under the law with the 14th Amendment, and we extended the Bill of Rights to apply to state governments as well. Prior to the 14th Amendment, state governments could trample over your rights, just the federal government couldn't violate the Bill of Rights. After the 14th Amendment, we gave the federal government the power to step in and say, through the Supreme Court review, judicial review, say, this state law is violating this person's natural rights as outlined in our Bill of Rights. So because generations have upheld that ideal and builded on it, this country has grown great. And they've been generous with that. But if we don't continue to hold on to that ideal and uphold it, and we don't share the blessing that we've received with others, then we certainly will decline. So what do we do about America's problems? We have to have a universal mind. And in my opinion, believe that we're meant to be a model nation, an elder brother nation to others. Help where we can, but not impose our will on others. And we need to solve the problems that we have at home, all of the challenges that we're facing. Okay, thank you very much.